I'd like to call this hearing of the House Aviation Subcommittee to order. Welcome everyone today. The subject of today's hearing is the next generation air transportation system financing options. The order of business will be as follows. We will have opening statements by members, and after that we have one panel of witnesses, and I understand one of our witnesses is not able to be with us because he's ill, and that's Gerald L. Thompson of Jerry Thompson and Associates. So that's the only change in the order of business. With that, welcome everyone again, and I'll start with an opening statement, and then I'll yield to other members. As I said, today's hearing is going to focus on our options for financing our Federal Aviation Administration, and more specifically, the next generation air transportation system, which is commonly referred to as NGATS. This topic, of course, will be the major issue in next year's reauthorization of our federal aviation programs. As discussed at the subcommittee's hearing on air traffic control modernization in June, NGATS involves a major redesign of our air transportation system that will move much of the existing air traffic control infrastructure from earth to sky by replacing antiquated, costly ground infrastructure with a system of orbiting satellites, onboard automation, and digital data link communications. Although we do not yet have an official cost estimate for NGATS, preliminary information indicates that FAA may need on average an additional $1 million a year, probably for the next 20 years, to implement NGATS, and at the same time keep our existing air traffic control system running. One issue that I hope to address today is whether or not the Aviation Trust Fund can in fact afford to provide this increased level of investment. The trust fund, and that's in light of the trust fund revenues being down significantly from the levels that were projected prior to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The 9/11 attacks, combined with weak economic conditions, and also the element of, on average, lower airfares, have resulted in 3 consecutive years of declining trust fund revenues. They've gone from $10.5 billion in fiscal year 2000 to $9.3 billion in just the time to 2003. Although revenues have since been on an upward trend, they're still below what was once expected. And the uncommitted cash balance in the trust fund has been dramatically reduced from $7.3 billion at the end of fiscal year 2001 to $1.9 billion at the end of 2005. Even if the Aviation Trust Fund revenues are sufficient to pay for NGATS, achieving a $1 billion annual increase in FAA's budget would still be difficult under our current set of budget rules. This is because the aviation user charges are currently subject to split budget treatment, whereby the revenues from aviation system users come in on the mandatory side of the budget, but they must be spent, unfortunately, on the discretionary side of the budget, where they're also subject to some of the discretionary spending limits. Therefore, under current budget rules, spending from the trust fund must compete with all other discretionary spending in the federal budget. That makes it very difficult to achieve the substantial budget increases that we're going to need for a huge program like NGATS. Rather than focusing solely on the cost of implementing NGATS, it's also important to recognize the cost of not doing so. According to the JPDO, the Joint Planning Development Office, by the year 2020, the cost to our economy of not implementing NGATS could reach as much as $40 billion a year. In addition to this enormous economic loss, a failure to implement NGETS would also have a huge price tag in terms of foregone productivity savings. According to some estimates, a failure to implement NGETS would result in FAA operating losses that are $29 to $49 billion higher over the period from 2006 to 2025. Viewed in these terms, the cost of not implementing NGETS clearly far exceeds the cost of implementing NGETS by possibly more than $400 billion through 2025, a pretty dramatic amount. Unfortunately, in today's constrained budget environment, the immediate need to finance everyday operations often takes a precedent over longer-term capital investments. We have the same problem if you look at inline explosive detection systems. Despite the fact that these systems more than pay for themselves in productivity savings in just a few years, we've been unable to adopt a common sense solution that would provide upfront capital investment that's required to deploy these systems in a timely manner, realize the savings by eliminating personnel and antiquated systems. So this is sometimes a penny-wise and pound-foolish approach. In the face of budget constraints, federal agencies have used a variety of methods to finance big capital asset projects. Two such methods that have been mentioned in the context of NGETS are leasing and also bonding. In addition, cost-based user fees that could be spent outside the discretionary spending limits have also been discussed. In preparation for next year's FAA reauthorization bill, when our current aviation excise taxes must either be extended or replaced, the FAA has called for a dialogue on alternative ways to finance the aviation system in the future. And that dialogue, as you know, has gone on for some months now. And at some point, we're going to have to conclude that and take some action, hopefully, as we begin the next session of Congress. The FAA believes that certain industry trends, such as lower airfares and the use of smaller aircraft, will also exacerbate the mismatch between its workload and its revenues in the future. Cost-based user fees are often mentioned as one way to link aviation revenues more closely to FAA's costs and potentially also to deal with funding. To the extent such fees can be linked to FAA's funding, they could provide a way to fund needed investments in our aviation system. Of course, today we'll hear from a panel of witnesses that's, I believe, uniquely qualified to help us look at some of the pros and cons of each of these approaches to financing both the FAA and NGETS, this expensive capital requirement. So I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses. I've made no commitments to any plan, and now I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Costello.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I thank you for calling this hearing today. I think all of us understand that the information that we are reviewing is very preliminary. While we have some idea of what capabilities will likely comprise the next generation air transportation system, such as precision satellite-based navigation, we do not yet have an enterprise architecture that fully explains the next generation system. And while we have an unofficial administration NGAT capital cost estimate of approximately $15 billion, between $1 and $2 billion a year for the next 10 to 15 years, we do not have an administration witness here today to explain how they arrived at their cost estimates. As the subcommittee prepares to take up the FAA reauthorization bill, we will need to find out whether or not the Aviation Trust Fund can support the next generation system. The information before us today suggests that it can. For fiscal year 2006, CBO estimates that receipts plus interest into the trust fund will total about $11.2 billion. The CBO also projects that the trust fund revenue will increase almost 32% to $14.8 billion in 2011 and over 71% to $19.2 billion in 2016. Based on these projections, it appears that the preliminary $15 billion capital cost estimate for NGAT could be absorbed by the existing FAA financing structure with a general fund contribution that is consistent with or even smaller than recent general fund contributions. This new information raises questions about the administration's claims that there is a revenue crisis at the FAA. The administrator, Administrator Blakey, has said that there is a gap between revenue going into the trust fund and FAA's cost, and that this so-called gap caused a $5.4 billion decline in the trust fund's uncommitted balance since fiscal year 2002. I disagree. First, what the administrator calls a gap between trust fund revenues and FAA cost is actually the general fund contribution. Historically, the general fund contribution has been relatively low in recent years. Over the past 20 years, the general fund contribution has averaged 27% of FAA's total budget. However, over the past 10 years, it has averaged only 20%. The American people clearly receive a tremendous benefit from a safe and efficient air transportation system. Therefore, any discussion of financing the next generation system must include a contribution from the general fund. Second, the shrinking uncommitted balance is not the result of inadequate revenue, but inadequate revenue forecasting by the FAA. Under the current statutory formula, the amount drawn from the trust fund must equal FAA's forecasted receipts and interest into the trust fund for that year. For the last few years, FAA's forecasts have been overly optimistic, and the discrepancy between what is drawn from the trust fund's uncommitted balance. Congress could fix this problem by changing the formula to link the amount appropriated from the trust fund to actual rather than forecasted revenue. The GAO has suggested this approach, and I look forward to hearing from the GAO witness on this issue. That said, I believe Congress should also review the FAA's tax and financing structure in the FAA's upcoming reauthorization bill. However, I have serious reservations with imposing a direct user fee. If we accept that the policy goal of the Congress should be to better align FAA's revenue with user activity, there are ways that this can be accomplished within the existing tax structure. By working within the existing tax structure, we will avoid the costly administrative burdens of implementing a user fee-based system. Some have suggested that Congress should consider alternative financing mechanisms such as leasing or bonding. I agree that all options should be examined and be on the table. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will submit my full statement for the record, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today.
Without objection, the entire statement of the ranking member will be made part of the record. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Coble.
Mr. Chairman, I will not take the full 5 minutes. You indicated financing options is the order of the day, and every issue discussed, we'll strike that, practically every issue discussed on this Hill sooner or later involves financing options, today being no exception. And I appreciate the interest that you and the distinguished gentleman from Illinois have directed to the issue of next generation air transportation systems financing, and I share that interest, and I appreciate your having called the hearing. I have 2 other meetings, Mr. Chairman, so I may be circuitously coming and going, but I think it'll be a good hearing, and I thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and thank you for the brevity of your statement. In fact, high above the future NGAT system, somewhere in the heavens, there'll be a special place for you. Thank you. Mr. Costello, who do you have now? Ms. Berkeley.
Thank you, Mr. Micah. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Costello, I thank you for holding this hearing on what I consider a very important topic. The FAA's plan for the next generation air transportation system is very ambitious. I'm anxious to hear how both how we could pay for it and how it would be integrated into our current system. The district that I represent is uniquely dependent on a safe and efficient air transportation system. McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas handled almost 44 million passengers last year, and I have no doubt that we will exceed that number in 2006. I'm concerned about the ability of the FAA to handle the current volume of air traffic, which continues to increase yearly. I look forward to hearing the views of our witnesses about whether the FAA's plan to keep up with growth in the system is affordable and feasible, and I'm anxious to hear your funding suggestions. And I thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady also for her brevity. And Mr. Lobiondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling the hearing. I think we can all agree it's critical for us to get started developing and testing and fielding the NGAT system as soon as possible. The system will improve safety and reduce operating costs for the FAA and industry, but as you pointed out, it's extremely expensive and it will be very difficult and put a strain on our current system with an already overextended trust fund. I hope we can find a creative way to reauthorize the trust fund that will ensure sufficient resources to keep the current system running while we develop and deploy NGATs. And I'm looking forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, if we look over time, we find that basically the general fund contribution, that is the support to aviation, the issues before us, has gone from about 48% down to 18% in 2006. I guess, you know, one question I hope the panel would address is, you know, what is an appropriate level for general public investment versus, you know, whatever new ideas or iteration of user fees or targeted taxes you're going to propose, because I think there are some strong arguments to be made regarding the national interest here, the national airspace, the efficiency of the air transportation system and the safety in this country, and particularly some new issues in that area post 9/11. So I'd question whether 18% is adequate, and of course that somewhat sets the stage for what other and how many other revenues we're looking for given the needs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, will be brief. I do look forward to this hearing and all the hearings we're going to have, obviously, when it comes to reauthorization and how we're going to fund the next generation system and modernization in general. I know there's still a lot of different options out there, but I do think we ought to proceed with some caution and figure out what it is we're going to do before we figure out how to fund it. I think it's a little bit, or at least getting the cart ahead of the horse when we don't know exactly how much money it is that we're going to need or exactly what it is that we're going to use it on. I think we just need to be careful as we move forward, and I look forward to hearing what the panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhl. Any other members with opening statements or remarks? If there are no other members with opening statements, we'll turn to our panel of witnesses and welcome back Dr. Gerald Dillingham, Director of Civil Aviation Issues with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. He is accompanied by Dr. Susan Irving, Director of the Federal Budget Issues with the same office, and we've got Dr. Donald Marone, Acting Director of the Congressional Budget Office, Professor John Hansman, the Director of MIT International Center for Air Transportation, and co-chairman of FAA's Research, Engineering, and Development Advisory Committee. And then Ms. Ellen Jewett, Vice President and Manager of the Transportation Group of Infrastructure Investment Banking with Goldman Sachs. So I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses. If you have any additional information other than your statement or lengthy information you'd like added to the record, just a request through the chair would be appropriate. So with that, we'll welcome back Dr. Dillingham with GAO. Welcome, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Micah. Mr. Costello, members of the subcommittee. As you know, GAO has been reviewing FAA's ATC modernization program for this committee for many years. Because of its size, complexity, and the history of schedule delays and cost overruns, it has been on our high-risk list since 1995. Over the last 2 years, we've reported considerable improvement in the modernization program's ability to acquire major systems on time and on budget. We've also seen the effects of a cyclical nature of the aviation industry on the ATC system, from the major delays experienced throughout the system through the downturns just prior to and after 9/11. Today, we see a return of significant delays and a system under increasing stress. Through all of this, aviation continues to be an important part of the U.S. economy. Recent aviation forecasts predict up to 1 billion passengers in the system by 2015. These forecasts also predict that not only will there be more traditional aircraft entering the system, there will also be hundreds of very light jets, greater civil use of unmanned aerial vehicles, and mega aircraft such as the Airbus A380. The consensus of opinion is that the nation's current ATC system cannot handle this predicted growth and cannot be scaled up to meet a possible tripling of traffic by 2025. As Chairman Micah stated, the JPDO has estimated that as soon as 2 years from now, the difference between the total flights that people want to fly and those that can be delivered with no new investment in the system would be worth about $12 billion to the economy. By 2020, these economic losses will increase to about $40 billion a year. These are the kinds of predictions that contributed to the Congress establishing the JPDO to plan for the transformation of the ATC system to the next generation system. The NGATS transformation will be one of the federal government's most comprehensive and technically complex undertaking, and a preliminary estimate indicates it will also be an expensive undertaking. Regarding the cost of NGATS, Mr. Chairman, the bottom line here is that at present, there is no comprehensive estimate of the cost of NGATS. Instead, what we have is a limited preliminary cost estimate developed by FAA's Research, Engineering, and Development Advisory Committee, an estimate that has not been endorsed by FAA and only provides a point of reference. As the chairman indicated in his opening remarks, the REDAC estimate suggests that FAA will need an average of at least $1 billion more annually over the next 20 years than FAA's 2006 appropriation. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Costello, and members of the subcommittee, this estimate must be viewed within the context of a number of limiting factors. First, JPDO has yet to complete the system's enterprise architecture, which is critical to the development of a reliable cost estimate. Second, many costs, such as the cost of early technology development, training, and the cost that other JPDO partner agencies might incur, are not included. And finally, the estimate is in today's dollars and does not take into account the effect of inflation. Regardless of what the final costs turn out to be, any discussion of how to pay for NGATS must also take into account the funding of near-term sustainment of the current air traffic control system. These discussions should also consider the federal government's long-term fiscal imbalance. My written statement discusses the details of funding the current system and the transition to NGATS through the existing system of excise taxes and the contributions of the general fund. This statement also discusses alternative funding options to collect revenues from the users of the system and implications for allowing FAA to use debt financing for capital projects. Regarding alternative options, Our work indicates that the degree to which alternative funding options could address concerns about the existing system ultimately depends on the extent to which the contributions required from the users actually reflect the costs they impose on the system. Given the diverse nature of FAA's activities, and if Congress decides that an alternative is needed, we think that a combination of options may offer the most promise for linking revenues and cost. It is also true that switching to any alternative funding option would raise the administrative and transition issues, such as developing the administrative capacity to implement the new system. Regarding debt financing, although some have suggested that debt financing offers some advantages, there are also some serious implications that should be recognized. For example, debt financing encumbers future resources and may raise questions about congressional oversight. In addition, debt financing raises issues regarding borrowing costs that are particularly important in light of the federal government's long-term structural fiscal imbalance. Mr. Chairman, we think that all options with their advantages and disadvantages should be on the table for consideration. We also think that the cost side of the ledger should continue to be a major consideration in the discussion of funding ATC modernization. FAA's recent contracting out of flight service stations and its exploration of sharing the risk and cost of the development of ADS-B system with the private sector are positive developments. GAO has also previously recommended that FAA needs to complete and institutionalize those business processes that allow it to meet its acquisition goals for the last 2 years. Additionally, we recommended that FAA work with Congress and other stakeholders to develop and implement a comprehensive modernization and consolidation plan for its facilities. GAO continues to think that actions such as these must be part of the funding discussion in the transformation of the FAA for the 21st century. Mr. Chairman, Dr. Irvin and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you and members of the subcommittee may have.
Well, thank you, and we'll hold questions till we've heard from all of the witnesses. And next we have, now I guess Susan Irving is not making a statement, but she's available for questions. But our next witness will be Donald Marone, Acting Director of the Congressional Budget Office. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Costello, members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss the financing of new investments in the air traffic control system and the way spending on such investments would be recorded in the budget. Developing and deploying a new air traffic control system would likely require significant investments by the federal government or by entities acting on its behalf. The potential for such investments raises a number of important questions. First, to what extent might such spending fit within the potential resources of the Airport and Airway Trust Fund? To address that question, my written testimony describes one scenario that reflects CBO's most recent baseline budget estimates. Following rules that are established in budget law, those estimates assume that existing trust fund revenue sources are extended over the next 10 years, that appropriations for the FAA grow with inflation from the level appropriated for 2006, and that the share of funding from general revenues remains at roughly 19%, approximately the same level as in 2006. Under those assumptions, CBO estimates that uncommitted balances in the trust fund would increase from slightly less than $2 billion at the end of 2006 to about $19 billion at the end of 2016, with most of that increase occurring after 2010. By themselves, those projections suggest that the trust fund may have room for an additional $19 billion in spending over the next 10 years. Of course, whether those balances actually materialize will depend on the accuracy of the revenue estimates and the levels of funding that Congress actually chooses to provide. A second question is how investment in a new system would be recorded in the budget in the congressional budget process. Under the accounting principles that govern the federal budget, budget authority and outlays should generally be recorded up front when the asset is acquired and investments are made, regardless of how the new investments are financed. That is how funding for the air traffic control system is currently handled. Budget authority is recorded when appropriation laws are enacted, and outlays are recorded when the government makes actual cash payments. Outlays for capital goods, for example, computer systems and radar, thus occur when they are paid for, not over their useful life. Most of the government's capital investments are recorded in the budget in that way, because that approach provides the Congress with the most direct ongoing control over spending. Of course, that approach also requires that the full cost of investment projects must compete against other budgetary priorities. An issue sometimes arises as to whether that budgetary treatment would be different if agencies could procure capital assets using special financing approaches, such as capital leases, lease purchases, or public-private partnerships in which non-federal entities provide finance on behalf of the government. The short answer is no. Under such arrangements, an agency might make annual payments over a period of years rather than dispersing the full cost of the investment when it is acquired. Nevertheless, established budgetary principles require that the full cost be recorded up front if the federal government is the sole or dominant user of the asset. In such cases, the arrangements are actually a form of purchase by the government. To ensure that all such purchases are treated the same way, budgetary principles require that all be recorded in the same manner regardless of the method of financing. The only exception is for routine operating leases, for example, for commercial office space that's not constructed specifically for the government. In considering alternative financing methods, it should also be noted that the least expensive form of financing is through the U.S. Treasury. Conventional Treasury securities are the gold standard of bonds because they are free from the risk of default and are highly liquid. Other means of borrowing funds, whether by creating new types of federal bonds or working through private entities, all involve greater costs since investors will demand higher returns and intermediaries will require fees. A third question is how Congress should allocate costs amongst taxpayers and various users of the system. From an economic perspective, it is generally desirable to require users of a system to pay for it. That way, the choices they make will take into account the costs of providing the service. Users of air traffic control services currently pay a substantial portion of the cost of providing those services, mostly through the ticket and other taxes, reflecting the fact that a large portion of the benefits of the system accrue to them. Allocating those costs, or the cost of a new system, efficiently and fairly among different types of users presents challenges, however. Quantifying how individual aircraft impose costs on the air traffic control system may be difficult. Also, the provision of air traffic control services may entail substantial costs that cannot readily be allocated to a particular user, but that must be incurred to provide the services at all. The resolution of those and related issues would determine how efficiently air traffic control services and the national airspace are used. Thank you. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, and we'll hear now from Professor John Hansman, who's director of MIT International Center for Air Transportation. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Micah, Mr. Costello, and the rest of the members. I'm a professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT and also co-chair of the FAA Research and Development Advisory Committee. There's a general consensus, has already been discussed, that the current air traffic control paradigm and air transportation paradigm will not scale to meet future demand. And the next generation air transportation system offers a coordinated national response to that. Recognize the importance of NGATS, the REDAC established a working group on financing the next generation air transportation system chaired by Mr. Jerry Thompson, who unfortunately is ill and couldn't be here today. The approach of the working group took was to compare a reference status quo scenario, basically if we kept with the existing paradigm, to an NGAT scenario and considered best, worst, and baseline cases in a parametric analysis. The analysis of the NGAT scenario required the working group to create a model of the rollout of NGAT's capabilities based on the best available knowledge of that system as it existed at the time of the analysis. The details of the report are in my written comments and in the working group report, but the bottom line can be seen in Figure 6 of my written report, which has already been referred to earlier today. In both the status quo and NGAT scenarios, the annual average costs over the 20-year period are on the order of $15.5 billion for the median case. However, as an investment in the future, the NGAT scenario requires an upfront investment, higher costs in the early years, and is expected to have cost savings in the out years. In order to estimate the FAA NGAT's funding requirements, the working group also compared the cost estimates with a model of the FAA Aviation Trust Fund revenue, assuming recent levels of general fund contributions on the order of 20%. Has already been mentioned by others, the model for the mid-case has an expected shortfall of approximately $1 billion over the next several years until the NGAT's operational improvements yield cost savings. The working group explored a number of alternatives for closing the near-term funding group, including increasing the general fund contribution, reduction of FAA costs. The working group identified approximately $500 million of potential costs, but they would not be realized immediately. There's an increase in user taxes and fees, and then financing options that bridge the near-term gap. The working group also made preliminary assessment of user taxes and fee approaches. No one approach was identified as optimal. A hybrid approach is likely, and more details are included in the working group report. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And last witness is Ellen Jewett. She's Vice President and Manager of the Transportation Group of Goldman Sachs. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Micah, Congressman Costello, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today on the next generation air transportation system financing options. The NGATS initiative is a worthwhile and necessary step towards securing our nation's future development in aviation, and I am pleased to be part of the discussion on how to properly fund it. Historically, the FAA has relied on approximately 80% of its funding from the Aviation Trust Fund, which is set to expire by this time next year. As the FAA embarks on its ambitious NGATS program, as well as restructuring the trust fund, this is an optimal time to explore alternative funding sources. There are three primary capital markets options that the FAA could evaluate to fund NGATS. On the traditional end of the spectrum, the FAA could borrow from the U.S. Treasury, which would provide the lowest cost of capital. However, from a capital markets perspective, borrowing treasuries is expensive in its lack of flexibility, particularly as they cannot be called or refinanced. The debt capital markets offer another solution for the program's funding gap. In 2005, more than $450 billion of municipal bonds were issued with a total market size of $2.3 trillion. Of the total issued last year, more than 60% were revenue bonds, or bonds that are backed by the revenues of a project or asset, as opposed to the taxing power of the government. This robust market provides an opportunity for issuers to borrow against any type of revenue, including any user fee, without recourse back to the governmental entities. A particular approach that is widely used and ensures the highest security to a bondholder is a securitized revenue structure. Under this structure, the FAA or a conduit issuer levies a charge which is then passed through a special purpose entity and is irrevocably pledged to the bondholders. How might this revenue securitization model be applicable to the NGATS program? One example is through a securitization of FAA revenue or user fees. How the fee is levied, ticket tax, passenger levy, airline charge, is less important to the capital markets than whether it is a stable revenue stream. A portion of this charge would be irrevocably pledged to a special purpose vehicle that would issue bonds backed by the expected regular collections of those fees. These collections would be used to pay principal, interest, and other related costs. The special purpose vehicle would remain legally remote from the FAA. In order to ensure the involvement of all users of the system, a capital policy board could be set up to determine the scope of the capital financing plan and to enact it on behalf of the FAA. It is envisioned that members from all interested parties, airlines, airports, labor, would be represented along with members of the FAA. This board would ultimately determine the size and strategies governing the financing and set rules to ensure accountability. There are a number of benefits to this financing structure. The most important to note is that neither the FAA nor the U.S. government is obligated to pay anything. Should the revenue collections fall short of necessary debt payments, there is no recourse back to the FAA or the government. Additionally, there's no FAA operational risk. Thus, the FAA is able to transfer its risk and collect money up front to fund a significant investment in aviation infrastructure. The public policy implications are important. Under the proposed securitization structure, the FAA could separate the public policy determination of financing needs and capital plan from the execution of the financing. By granting a legally separate oversight board the authority to control the amount and timing of the issuance of securities, the board would have the right to review and/or reject the proposed financing plan. Thus, users of the system who would be impacted by the financing decisions would have a direct role in determining if such a financing is necessary. The third and more radical alternative to solve the funding gap would be to explore the burgeoning public-private partnership market, which result in effectively transferring assets to private operators. With a large demand for projects that produce long-term steady revenue streams and thus long-term steady revenue returns from a wide variety of pension funds, insurance companies, and private equity funds, this market could provide an additional or alternative source of funds for the FAA. It is not unusual for governments to tap private investors for funding assistance. In fact, there are numerous examples of the Army or Navy leasing all of the housing on its bases to private developers. In the United Kingdom and Canada, private partnerships form the basis for management of the air traffic control systems. The FAA has already enacted such a program under the Pilot Privatization Act, whereby a private entity can own and operate airports in the U.S. through a long-term performance-based concession. Currently, there's one small airport in New York that has been privatized under this approach, and additionally, Chicago Midway Airport has just submitted an application to seek privatization under the Act. This recent surge in interest in privatizing airports could signal that the public-private partnership market may be a very real and viable alternative to a debt financing. That concludes my statement, Chairman Micah. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I'd be pleased to address questions you may have.
Well, thank you all, and we'll turn to some questions, and I'll start out with the first question for GAO. How confident are you that either the FAA or the FAA's Research, Engineering, and Development Advisory Committees come up with NGATS costs that are realistic?
Chairman Micah, we are not very confident for a number of reasons, particularly the fact that that critical document, that enterprise architecture is missing. Additionally, there are many, many costs that are not accounted for.
Now that architecture, enterprise architecture that you spoke of, it's my understanding that won't be available till the middle of next year. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir. That's our understanding. And in addition to that architecture, even though I would say that it's necessary, it's certainly not going to be sufficient. There's going to be costs associated with technology development, which it hasn't been determined who's going to pay for it, how much is it going to be. There's going to be costs associated with training air traffic controllers and pilots for the transformation. There'll be all kinds of costs for other partner agencies that have not been accounted for. So it's necessary, but certainly not sufficient. More work will certainly have to be done, even when that architecture is available.
One of the problems, too, that we've had is the estimated revenues versus the actual revenues, which the ranking member spoke about, have been sort of off base pretty seriously, I guess, since 2001. They've gotten a little bit better this past year. What do we do about that, and what do you attribute that to? Dillingham and then Hansman?
Chairman Micah, we reported to you about that problem of the underestimation of forecasted resources, and since that time, well, a couple of things. One is part of that was attributed to some unforeseen external circumstances, post 9/11, SARS, those kinds of things, but also because, as it turns out, their forecasting model had some problems that contributed to it being off to that degree. We know that they have attempted to address those problems. The more recent forecasts have been closer.
Mr. Marone or Mr. Hansman?
Yeah, after the forecast went low, or the projections were high, starting really in 2001 after the attacks. This was partly the attacks, partly due to underlying changes in the air transportation industry, lower yields, use of smaller aircraft, higher frequency of service. And as Mr. Dillingham pointed out, the forecasts have been better in the past year.
Mr. Morrow.
And just to round it out, so we observed the same thing, that the FAA revenue misses were due to 9/11, various shocks to the industry, greater penetration of low-cost carriers. I should say from CBO's point of view, we also make projections of revenues. Until about a year ago, we based our projections, we in essence went to the FAA, gave them our own economic assumptions and asked them what the projection would be, so we relied very heavily on their model. In the last year or so, we've been developing our own separate independent model for forecasting these revenues. At the moment, the projections that we have look relatively similar to what the FAA has. We're a little bit lower than they are. Over time, I suspect that process of having two independent cracks at this will shed light for both sides about the best way to estimate these revenues going forward.
Okay. In May of 2005, Mr. Dillingham, you testified before the subcommittee that a zero uncommitted cash balance in the trust fund would require FAA to make significant spending cuts to aviation programs currently supported by the trust fund unless additional funding were appropriated from the general fund. Specifically, you stated that FAA officials told GAO that if the uncommitted balance reached zero, in order to fund air traffic control services, FAA would have to suspend activities like AIP, facilities and equipment and research accounts. Is this still your understanding about what would happen if we reached a uncommitted balance of zero?
Chairman Micah, that's still our understanding. FAA states that the safe movement of traffic would be their primary objective, and all other things would have to fall in behind that in terms of available funding.
Well, it's my understanding that the Highway Trust Fund's been allowed to operate in the negative uncommitted cash balance area for a number of years now without impacting highway programs. Anyone like to speak to the sort of the inequity treatment of the two funds?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Part of that, it is essentially a function of how the Congress has set up the two trust funds. No agency can commit funds without budget authority. And you have set up the Aviation Trust Fund in a certain way, and then it requires appropriations to commit general revenues. The Highway Trust Fund cannot commit funds without budget authority either. The Highway Trust Fund's budget authority comes in the form of contract authority, which is then subject to obligation limits imposed by the Appropriations Acts. Under the safety legislation, that authority is adjusted to reflect actual receipts. You've all lived through the RABA adjustments. Because of the way the program was set up, the obligations for these projects, for which money is outlaid over a number of years, can be met using future tax revenues. It's a function of the way the two funds were set up.
Any recommendation towards adopting a similar mechanism?
No, I think there are a number of things you would need to consider. Fundamentally, as you know, the U.S. government handles highways differently than aviation. The Highway Trust Fund collects revenues from users and distributes them to states and to projects which are then not run or owned by the federal government. We have chosen as a nation to have the air traffic control system be a national activity and to have those people be federal employees and it run by the federal government. I think that it's essentially a policy decision for the Congress to make. And
if we want to change that out, yeah.
And
well, there are a number of questions that are raised too in how we finance the system and equity in those decisions. We now have a deficit of about, well, I shouldn't say a deficit, but we have a general revenue contribution of about $2 billion a year. And if we add in an average of $1 billion for NGATs, we're looking at a substantial additional cost. And also the question is raised as to who should pay for that. Should it be those who benefit from the system on some user basis, or does the general taxpayer have the responsibility, even though they may never fly some guy out in the middle of Podunk, USA, be responsible for paying the existing cost and then a little bit more for this new system? Mr. Dillingham, any thoughts? Any of the other panelists?
Chairman Micah, the point we are now, of course, the bottom line, of course, is it's a congressional policy decision. But after having said that, there are probably lots of options, and what we've said is that probably a combination of things should be looked at, the pros and cons of a combination of things to see how to fund the aviation system. But we also believe that there is a public interest in the aviation system, and that public interest should be supported by a contribution from the general fund, because the contributions of the aviation system, it's not only for those who fly, but it's also for those in podunk that also benefit from the system.
One final question. I probably can't answer this. I looked at the chart that shows basically the cost of implementing the NGATS, and I guess without the system architecture and some of those costs, we really can't tell if there are any. I mean, we have some estimates that we've been given, but you can't tell if there's considerable spikes at any point, or if that billion is going to turn into a $3 billion at one point because of heavy equipment costs or whatever, facilities expansion. So we really don't know, do we, the flow of the money that's going to be required.
I think Professor Hansman probably can add to this, but our understanding, based on the estimates that we see, is that we talk about an average annual expenditure of about $1 billion, meaning, or at least we're interpreting that to mean that there will be probably higher cost early on in terms of capital development, and subsequently that leveling out as the equipment is in fact acquired. But a point also is that air traffic control modernization is probably going to be with us for as long as we're around, because as soon as we get to the next generation, we're going to be talking about the next generation as well.
Okay. Mr. Costello, I'm going to have some more questions, but we'll yield to other members.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Dillingham, thank you for speaking up for Podunk America. But let me say that in my opening statement, I agree with you that there are a number of people in this country who may never fly, but the fact of the matter is that a safe and efficient aviation system is good for our economy and our country, and everyone benefits from it. So I appreciate your comments and strongly feel that there has to be a contribution from the general fund as we proceed to implement NGATS. Dr. Marone, let me ask a couple of questions if I can. CBO projected rate of growth for the Aviation Trust Fund. What's the annual rate of growth above inflation? What are you projecting?
So it's roughly, I won't give you a specific number, but in essence, the flows into the trust fund are rising a little bit faster than the overall growth rate of the economy, so a little bit faster than inflation plus real GDP growth. That's primarily driven by an observation historically that air travel and related things seem to grow somewhat faster than the economy historically.
So it would be between 2 and 5%?
Yes, it would be inflation plus, I think it's somewhere in the 3-ish range.
Okay. And you attribute that to?
So growing economy, which generates growing air travel, and then the fact that historically it appears that air travel actually grows a little bit faster than the economy.
CBO completed a 10-year trust fund projection, and you based that, that was in April of 2006, based upon the FAA's F&E cost for the next generation system, as well as Vision 100, the statutory formula, as well as looking at the other 3 major accounts adjusted for inflation. And it's my understanding that based upon that review, that CBO has estimated that the trust fund, in fact, could absorb the capital cost of NGAT for a general fund, with a general fund contribution of about 21%. Is that correct?
Yep. So that's correct. Let me describe a little bit sort of qualitatively how that comes about. In essence, we have a system which, if the various tax components get extended, many of them are scheduled to expire, but if they get extended, you have a revenue stream which is in essence growing with the rate of the economy and a little bit more. Under the conventional assumptions we use in constructing a baseline, the spending is assumed to grow just with inflation, so without real growth in it. And then if you in essence have over time that the revenues are larger than the spending, there's room to add on some spending for, say, some NGATS investments. Obviously, the estimates on that front are extremely preliminary. And there's room then also either to do more of that or to reduce what comes in from the general fund, or as you describe, sort of hold the general fund contribution relatively constant and have that additional investment.
So is that a long answer to saying that it's about 21%?
Yes, those numbers work, but not forget the additional cost elements that were put in there were obviously very preliminary.
Very good. Dr. Dillingham, actually for you or Ms. Irving, either one, I understand that CBO has stated that third-party financing, which may include leasing and other types of financing, that there are some negative consequences. And I wonder if you might comment as to your views. Are there negative consequences of financing arrangements which include leasing and privatization?
Mr. Costello, I think it's always good to know what your limits are. And since I know what my limits are, I'm going to ask Dr. Irving to respond to that.
My colleague is much too modest. Yes, as a number of the witnesses and as a number of you have stated, Treasury securities are the gold standard in the world. The federal government borrows more cheaply than any other enterprise. It is the least cost option have the federal government borrow this money than to have the federal government pay someone else to borrow at their borrowing rates.
But on the leasing side, if we are talking about an operating lease versus a capital lease, there are some advantages for the government to be involved in an operating lease in terms of the budget scoring and the money needed up front and a whole lot of other issues. This is the kind of lease that the government was involved in when they procured the WASP satellite system. It's the same kind of discussions that are going on now with regard to ADS-B, where the government would purchase a service and not be obligated to or assume the risk of the development of the infrastructure and so forth. As long as the circumstances are such that they meet CBO, OMB, and congressional guidelines for an operating lease, it is something that we think ought to be on the table to be considered where appropriate.
Dr. Dillingham, you, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the trust fund's uncommitted balance has shrunk significantly, and due largely because of the over-optimistic revenue forecast. You testified before the Senate, and I think in March of this year, and suggested a solution as to how that can be corrected. I wonder if you might elaborate just for the record.
Yes, sir. At that time, we suggested, since the forecast had been off so much based on forecasting, we suggested that one thing that Congress could consider would be to look at actual revenues as opposed to forecasted revenues. We also said at that point in time that could very well mean less immediate available spending for FAA, because the actuals are often smaller than the forecast, and the statutes at this point in time say you spend what's forecasted as such.
Very good. Last question in this round. Professor Hansman, is it your opinion that NGATS will increase productivity and drive down the FAA's operating cost?
I think that NGATS, if it's implemented and well-designed, remember, this is a system which is still being designed and prototyped. One of the clear objectives is to increase the productivity. One of the reasons why the system doesn't scale over time is that we can't continue to cut sectors into smaller and smaller chunks because we're limited by controller workload capability. So we will find a way to get more productivity out of the system. In all likelihood, it will be shifting some of the operational responsibility to the cockpits and things like that. So I think it will be more efficient. And if it's not more efficient, we shouldn't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I have to join with Mr. Costello in thanking Dr. Dillingham with his concern about podunk, since podunk happens to be in my district. The irony is only a mile and a half away from podunk is Harvard. So I have, as you can see, I have quite a diverse district. I just wanted a couple of different questions. And I appreciate, incidentally, Dr. Dillingham, your comments about there is a definite public interest in aviation, and that substantial part of it has to be financed out of the general fund. And I'm puzzled about the constant talk about user fees and so forth. It seems to me that's the wrong way to go. It makes it very cumbersome. It gets more expensive. And the best analogy I have is just our ordinary automobile traffic. We don't charge user fees. Everyone goes through an intersection and has the benefit of a traffic signal. Or when you put up a stop sign at the end of the street, you don't charge a user fee on all the people who live in that street. I think that analogy holds for aviation. It's a bit silly to get that specific about the cost. And I think because of the public interest, we should finance that part out of the general fund or out of the fuel taxes. A question for Mr. Hansman. In your best case NGATS scenario, REDAC assumes that after 2011, FAA operating costs would be reduced about 2% per year, resulting in a 25% cost saving by 2025, which sounds wonderful. Just what assumptions go into this, and how much confidence can we all place in these estimates of productivity savings?
Okay, the reason why this was done as a parametric analysis is because it's so preliminary. We're basically scoping the problem. So that's why it's the best case. So what we felt was that 2% was reasonable as a best case productivity improvement. We assumed in the baseline case it would essentially hold operations costs constant, and the worst case was that the operations costs would remain at the current levels per flight or per operation.
And are you reasonably confident that we can increase the productivity by that amount?
I'm confident we can increase the productivity. The U.S. actually has one of the highest productivity air traffic control systems in the world, but there's clearly inefficiencies in the system, and the way we do it is very labor intensive. So it's clear that there are opportunities for improvement. And if that's an objective of the system, it's clear to me that we can get improvements. Whether they'll be at a 1% level, 2% level, or 10% level is tough to say at this point.
Actually, I agree with you. The difficulty comes when there's an aircraft accident with a number of fatalities. Immediately, the outcry will be, you've cut the staff too much. And so it's hard to judge what impact that's going to have.
But I think we have to recognize that air traffic controllers don't fly the airplanes. And so that's one of the notions within NGATS is to move more of the responsibility to the cockpit where you actually have better information and are quicker. So I think you're right, there is always political pressure after an accident, but we really have to think about a system which is scalable for the future and is efficient.
Well, that can easily be done with the right electronic equipment and interfacing.
Yeah.
Question for Ms. Jewett. You gave a convincing case for using the public bond approach, but can you just tell me why it's better to do that than borrow from the United States Treasury?
I will give you one reason why it might be better. As we've all talked about U.S. Treasury being the lowest cost, one issue on the Treasury side, though, is the inflexibility to be able, an inability to be able to refund the bonds if the interest costs became lower. In the bond market, you could issue variable rate bonds, which are always lower cost than fixed rate, and you could structure a bond financing that would have possibly increasing debt service if there was a sense that the fees were going to increase. So there's more flexibility in the other options. A securitized model in today's market would really only cost 1/4 of a point in the market relative to a U.S. Treasury. So I'm not suggesting looking at a model that would be dramatically different or more expensive than what we have today. But treasuries are great, too.
All right, thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important subject, but just to get back to podunk for a second, I took the liberty of Googling podunk, and on Wikipedia, Mr. Ellers may want to edit it because they don't list one in Michigan. They have New York, Massachusetts, a couple others. So, Vern, you ought to get in there and edit that. So, thank you. I have a couple of questions that relate to this. I know it's hard to say, but I mean, and I guess no one wants to put a number on what would be the appropriate level of general fund contribution. Do any of you have any ideas on how we might go about if we wanted to reach that conclusion, sort of methodologically, looking at that which accrues generally to the society in terms of economic activity? For instance, in my hometown of Eugene, we have companies who come there, rather large companies, that say, well, in part we're here because we have very good access to San Francisco, you know, and we have down in the Silicon Valley another branch, and therefore we need to be moving people back and forth. So obviously there's some pretty interesting second, third level sorts of benefits that accrue to a national integrated system that's efficient. So does anybody have any ideas? I mean, since we're going to have this debate, I mean, this is next year, we're going to be having some significant portion of this debate. How much are we going to leave on the table for the general fund, or how much are we going to try and fight with the appropriators? Anybody want to give us an idea how we might get there?
So I'll start off so that I can be the first to give the Weasley answer, which, of course, in part, it's a political
Well, you did very well with Mr. Costello, too.
About distribution. But that said, I guess I would start, as a starting point, I would start at the other end and just point out that it's clear that a lot of the benefits of the system accrue to the people and cargo that fly. And so the starting point, I think, purely as an economist, leaving aside kind of political judgments and distributional judgments, is that clearly a significant portion should be borne by those direct beneficiaries of the system, just as we do for other types of products that, you know, we're able to produce in the economy without government intervention. And then it becomes, as you say, sort of a line drawing exercise of how far do you go. I haven't seen any good studies myself that would try to parse that out and give you ratios, I'm afraid. So,
right.
Weasley answer.
Ms. Irving?
I'll give you another version, I guess, of a Weasley answer, but also it's starting at the other end. One of the things that improved cost accounting can do is help you figure out something about the allocation of who imposes costs, which then can be, which is not the same as who benefits, but it will provide input as you begin to think of this balance between the costs imposed and the benefits received. The other thing you might want to, when you all are talking among yourselves, is this is not actually a unique argument in the government. When we think about funding drug approvals, it is not only drug manufacturers who benefit from a strong FDA, but those of us, I'm old, who did not take thalidomide. It is not only meat producers who benefit from meat inspection, but me when I grocery shop. So that there's some balancing, I think, between, but if you can learn what costs are imposed by whom, and then start from there, you may have a head start in your discussion about how much you believe should be taken from the collective to be used for the safety of the whole.
Of course, you have just opened a bit of another issue there, which is how we attribute the benefits received. And Mr. Lubinsky and I went through an exercise 4 or 5 years ago where we invited a whole host of experts into breakfast meetings from different sectors to talk about that. And, you know, you get a different answer from a point-to-point carrier than a hubbed carrier. You know, in terms of how one should assess certain costs on passengers, and you know, I mean, what the benefits are. I mean, is it harder for an air traffic controller to deal with a commuter flight in, you know, at lower elevations, you know, and you know, that has frequent landings in, you know, or a longer transcontinental flight, those sorts of things.
It's interesting because I think of that as part of the costs imposed, and that's some of the stuff my colleague talked about. Benefits is that I would suggest that the safety improvements on the airlines, for instance, benefit not only those on the airline, but those into whose homes the airlines do not crash.
Right.
So that's part of the balancing act I think you're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Mr. DeFazio, in a maybe not helpful immediately, but certainly an issue that has comes up continuously. The last time the committee had a hearing on small community air service, it comes up constantly in terms of the economic benefit that airline service brings to the communities. And each time we're asked to go out and try and quantify that, we find the studies don't hold up. We find that the information is just not there. So something in the future for almost every district that has a small air service is, to really work towards developing that kind of information that will add up to and support the notion of the economic benefits of having an airline come to those small communities and medium-sized communities.
Yes, sir.
So these are just a few thoughts. I actually have a doctoral student who's attempting to correlate the economic effect of air transportation, sort of in a general sense. We know that there's a correlation. We actually don't know what's cause and what's effect. I think that when you think about this air transportation system, it's important to separate out the air traffic control functions from the infrastructure functions. Because the air traffic control benefit is really the traffic cop. Okay, it's organizing traffic, it's an efficiency benefit versus the access issue. The other thing is, if you look at the U.S. in general, we have a society which has clearly become dependent on air transportation. That's why you touch podunk, because it's not just the travel, but it's the just-in-time inventory. It's all kinds of things that permeate through the system. And you can actually see diffusion of the U.S. population into regions which have good air service. So I think that there's clearly a benefit to the population at large, and it's important not to overly think about the intermediates who are the operators, but really think about who's getting the real benefit of having that infrastructure.
And if the chairman's successful in doing away with Amtrak, then it would be even more dependent upon. No, I didn't mean that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one more question here. I'm a bit puzzled by the JPDO projections on the costs to the economy, and if anybody here can because it says here, $12 billion in 2008, so on, in terms of foregone opportunity, I guess. It says difference between demand for air travel and the total flights that could be delivered with no new investment. I'm just puzzled by that number. If we're looking at $12 billion in 2008, that would imply that we probably are seeing foregone revenues today, or economic activity. I'm not aware that the system is that constrained today. Can anybody speak to how JPDO came up with these numbers and how they seem so large and go up so quickly?
I don't remember the details, so I'll just give you my impression. But we have a infrastructure which is starting to get to capacity limitations. I believe a lot of that effect are capacity constraints. I think there are also environmental and other costs that are put into it. In the way I believe they modeled it was to project the unconstrained demand, to look at the impact of the constraints, and then to value, by some measure, the travel that wasn't accomplished, or the economic activity that wasn't
Okay, so it's kind of a blue sky thing, like if everybody could just take off and fly whatever route they wanted to get wherever they wanted to go without any interference by air traffic control.
I believe it's a projection, and then if you start looking at the fact that we can't basically fly more airplanes into LaGuardia than we currently enable, that becomes a constraint. And there's an interesting question, because does that activity not exist, or does it deflect to other regions? And the real issue may not be a loss of overall activity, but a deflection to other places, either in the U.S. economy or, more worryingly, to other nations. So as our system becomes inefficient, then people will start locating in other locations because they're more efficient.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just for the record, the chairman is a strong advocate of long-distance national rail service and an extremely strong advocate of high-speed rail service. He is, however, in opposition of a Soviet-style current Amtrak operation. Miss Norton. Thank you for your brevity, Ms. Norton. A second round. I just want to follow up on the savings issue. Now, right now, I understand it costs us $14 billion to run our FAA system, a full system, about $2 billion general revenue. We'll just project this out, and we'll say it was going to cost us about $20 billion to run it. We'll just say by 2025. I'll just get, and I've heard that there could be as much as a 20% cost savings by 2025. Does that mean that the cost to operate, will just taking those ballpark figures, could be as low as $15 billion? Would that be a net savings in dollars, or would it just be in operational efficiencies, or what, Mr. Hansman?
Yeah, it would be net savings in dollars. And again, I apologize. I took a heat. I didn't do the calculation, but they're in 2005 dollars, so they're not inflated dollars. But the NGATS projection out in 2025 would be the total NGATS costs to the FAA would be on.
Would it be your estimate also that we could either be level or reducing the number of personnel? Now, this system is based on the highest technology. We're going to be able to sight planes with unprecedented precision. We will have technology both on the ground, in the plane, and satellite base that will give us unprecedented ability to track, to locate with redundant systems, so we could end up with net fewer personnel.
There would clearly be fewer personnel per operation. Remember, the number of flights goes up too, so you have to look at which dominates.
We're going to have more flights, but greater efficiencies in operation, greater accuracy in pinpointing the location of the aircraft, both on the ground, en route, et cetera.
And hypothetically, because of that, you get some environmental benefits. You can reduce the noise impact around airports, so you get benefits from there. You'll get fuel benefits. One of the things that's probably underrepresented, it's implicit in efficiency, is within NGATS, the things that you get in terms of efficiency and environmental efficiency are also fuel savings. So hypothetically, you'll get some benefit.
And what about some ground-based systems now that are necessary to bring planes in bad weather or inclement conditions? With this new technology, it won't be as necessary to be putting all those bucks into some of those systems as opposed to this system, or will it be necessary for a redundant system to continue building both those and having this in place?
You'll need some level of redundancy. You'll clearly be able to reduce the level of ground redundancy. One of the problems with a lot of our ground facilities, and one of the reasons why we have high costs, is because they're expensive to keep calibrated. If they're miscalibrated, if you have an ILS that's miscalibrated, you have people flying into hills. So you can't allow that. So we spend a lot of money calibrating that. Some of these systems will be more cost-effective from a maintenance standpoint. There will still be costs on the ground. So even if you have a GPS-based approach system, you're still going to have lights on the airport and communications facilities and things like that.
In addition to its ineptness in running a passenger rail service in the United States through a quasi-governmental entity, I found in my short 13.9 years on this committee that one thing the government doesn't do very well is R&D of high-tech systems, at least through FAA. It's just a horrendous record of cost overruns, inability to procure next generation anything. Mr. Dillingham and maybe Mr. Hansen, how do we avoid that? Now, we're looking at a new high-tech system. Again, I sat on this committee as a freshman somewhere down on that bottom pew and heard people telling me this next developmental project's right around the corner, just give us a few more billion. And then they'd come back in 2 years, just give us a few more billion, it's around the corner. And the private sector, in the meantime, because they changed the specs, they tweak the acquisition, the ineptness and the time period it takes to procure anything through the FAA system in the past, just ended up having the private sector would develop technologies that would be far and above what we had even come close to achieving. I've helped stop some of that. I call it chasing the dog chasing its tail. This is an expensive system. It's a next generation. We'll have some technologies we don't have now. How do we avoid repeating those same mistakes? Dillingham, Hanson.
Chairman Micah, the story that you just told is a story that we've been telling for almost 2 decades now about procurement and acquisition at FAA. The other part of the story is that Congress did act on this problem and establish the ATO as a performance-based organization, and as a part of that, mandated that it operate in a more business-like fashion, that it in fact address those issues of cost overruns and schedule delays. And at least for the last 2 years, for the first time in recent history, FAA is in fact meeting its cost and schedule goals for acquisition of major systems. The question becomes now, was this a flash in the pan, or do we have a way to institutionalize that this continues? Secondly, we've testified before you before and suggested that one of the missing elements for FAA is, do they have the expertise to acquire and manage such a very complicated undertaking as this? And we've suggested that they consider, and FAA has agreed to consider, employing a lead systems integrator or employing the expertise that is dedicated to FAA and not dedicated to its own ends to make sure that what you refer to and what we refer to as requirements creep and things like that are minimized.
Well,
so we're hopeful.
This is a big concern. Also, everybody's been polite, sort of working together. At some point, some hard decisions have to be made, and I think somebody has to be in charge with the ability to bring, now you're going to be dealing with DOD, NASA, DHS, and other agencies who all have their turf, who all have their agendas, but somebody has to be in charge of the thing and make decisions with milestones and deadlines and accountability, as we've learned the hard way through our FAA acquisition. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And not only somebody has to be in charge, but whoever's in charge has to transcend the administrations, has to transcend the secretaries that are on the decision-making bodies, because this is a multi-year, many-year operation. So again, that's why we say that cultural shift that's going on, plus whatever systems are in place that have made it work well for the last 2 years, needs to be attended to. And the buck has to stop someplace. It's not clear to us that there is an absolute end in JPDO as to who's in charge right now.
Exactly, and I think Marion Blakey, Rush Chu have done their part. But again, we're involved in low-hanging fruit at this stage. But to make this really happen, somebody's going to have some clout, some teeth, and some ability to transcend just a limited time, period in time and space. Hansman, did you have anything?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a tremendous challenge. I have concerns about how you actually do it, particularly as a multi-agency involvement. How do you manage through this? One of the reasons why it's hard to do major modernizations at the FAA is it's a big system. We have one of the biggest systems in the world. It's perceived as a safety critical system, so that someone doesn't like what's going on, they just raise the safety issue. And so it's a real challenge. It's going to require leadership and a structure that has the type of forcing function that was discussed.
Well, the other thing, too, riding on this that we haven't even talked about today is our standing in sort of dominating or being the premier airspace system, aviation system in the world. We lose skip a few beats here.
So
We'll
interestingly,
be looking at
the Australians are actually moving pretty quick because they have a smaller system that they have control over. And so it's been an interesting case that they're often leading the technology. They're the guys putting automatic dependent surveillance in already. So, I think that that's a challenge.
we haven't really gotten into the consequences for the U.S. falling behind, which would be horrible. Mr. Costello had another question.
Final question. Ms. Jewett, let me ask you, in your testimony, you talk about financing options, and you talk about the FAA or a conduit. Let me specifically ask you, on page 2, you say that there are a number of benefits to this financing structure. The most important to note is that neither the FAA nor the U.S. government is obligated under this structure to pay anything other than the transferring the pledged revenue collection. Should the revenue collections fall short of the necessary debt payments, there is no recourse back to the FAA or the government. It sounds like a deal that no one could refuse.
Too good to be true.
So there's no obligation on the part of the FAA or the American taxpayers if we set up this conduit and revenue falls short?
If you've created this capital policy board that directs the special purpose vehicle who is receiving, whether it's the ticket tax, the general fund money, a user fee, whatever it is, and the obligation in this securitized model is just on whatever revenues come into this box, if you will, of money. If for some reason the policy board hasn't directed an increase in user fees, say, or if the ticket taxes don't come in at the expected amount, that is the risk that the bondholder bears, the person who bought the bonds.
Well, the person who bought the bonds, but of course we have a system here that if in fact is implemented, we have to keep it running. And as I said in my opening comments, I am not opposed to these looking at all financing options and putting them on the table, but I've had an experience in dealing with some infrastructure where there was entities who operated and collected fees. Bonds were sold. The revenue did not cover the cost of operations, and both the state of Illinois and the state of Missouri had to step in, pay off the bonds, take over both of these structures, maintain it, and they continue to run it to this day. So, I just want to be clear on this, that if we could have closed the bridges down and said, we'll shut the bridges between Illinois and Missouri down because they're going to default on the bonds. But that, of course, would not be in the interest of the region or the American taxpayers. And if, in fact, we set up a system here, if it's a conduit, if it's some other type of a structure, in the end, the taxpayer is responsible for it if we intend to keep the system going.
I think what you're right in that there may be a moral obligation, but there wouldn't be a legal obligation. And in that, I could sense you were talking about the bridges. I don't remember whether there was a moral or a legal obligation in that particular situation, but
well, we sure wouldn't shut the system down.
No, you wouldn't shut the system down, and presumably in this case, one, you'd collect enough to have a coverage account on the side, possibly. Two, if you found that you were in a position where revenues were falling short, you'd restructure the debt. And that's the difference of what you can't do with treasuries. You can't restructure that debt, but here you can restructure it to meet the revenues. Third, you'd have the policy board presumably having an ability to raise fees and charges if you were getting to that point.
Let me ask that question of the GAO, either our CBO.
I'm happy to jump in. I guess the framework, I would say that to the extent that one is successful in setting up a structure that passes some risk on to private parties, they're going to ask you to pay for it in advance somehow in the compensation they get through the arrangement, so that in essence the government will be paying for it through some other form. And so then layer on top of that your concern, which is after the fact if something goes wrong, to the extent that it's something that's a significant governmental undertaking, as you said, the government will be on the hook for providing it anyway.
Which brings me to another project that was recently privatized where a lot of money was paid up front for this company to take over this structure, and the money that was paid to the governmental entity was not set aside for infrastructure. It was used for other governmental purposes. I wonder if the GAO would want to comment, Dr. Irving or Dr. Dillingham.
I think that Ms. Jewett's answer that there would be a moral obligation at the end answers that this is in effect the government using another vehicle to borrow more expensively for what the government could borrow. True, I actually do not understand the point about rigidity. I mean, the Treasury borrows at all kinds of maturities at the lowest rate possible. If you wanted to do the two-step version where Treasury borrows from the Federal Financing Bank, the Federal Financing Bank has the ability to lend to agencies at quite different, designs it in different ways, has a fair amount of flexibility, but it is still the Treasury going to the market. And there is the additional question of would you really want to hand to some private board the ability to impose what is called a user fee, but is in effect a tax?
Dr. Dillingham?
Again, that's about as far as I can go with it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to thank our witnesses.
Well, thank you.
Today.
Thank you also, Mr. Costello. I want to thank our witnesses. Now, we haven't answered how this is all going to be paid for, how it's all going to be designed and proposed. At this juncture, we've answered a few questions, but we've raised a bunch of questions. I think the important thing is that we look at this as not only a challenge, but a great opportunity to create truly a next generation air traffic control system and aviation system for this country and be on the cutting edge. And we're going to have, there's a lot of representatives in the audience from different organizations. Well, who's going to pay for it? Well, we're all going to pay for it. That guy in Podunk, we're going to figure out what his fair share is. And every one of you that's sitting here that have some interest in using and accessing this system are going to help pay for it. We're going to figure out a way to do that, stay ahead of the curve, and see how we can have, again, the very best system in the world and set the standard. The benefit will not only be for the United States, but think of the potential of having our system adopted around the world. And again, having us continue to keep and set the standard. So that's what we're going to do, with Mr. Costello's help and all of you out there. If we have to drag you kicking and screaming across the finish line, we're going to do it. Mr. Costello moves that the record be left open for a period of 2 weeks for additional comments and pledges of your financial contributions towards this effort. Statements, we'll welcome all of those. There being no further business to be before the subcommittee today, I thank again our witnesses and everyone for being with us. This hearing is adjourned. Gonna do it.